Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this special Insignia event. I know that many of you are used to joining our conventional webinars where I have a PowerPoint and share what wisdom I can with you, but today's a little bit different. I am really pleased to be joined by Richard Gaisford, Chief Correspondent from Good Morning Britain. Richard and I have known each other for, I think, more than 15 years now, both professionally, but also as avid fans of Hope Cove in Devon, where we bump into each other at boats or pubs typically, don't we, Richard? And yeah.
See, I
think, there at the moment.
I think it's nearer 20 to 25 years. I think it's almost a quarter of a century. It's a long time.
I think you're right. I was going to say that, but I feared I might be, making you feel older than you actually are. But I think you're right. It's more than 20 years, isn't it? It'd be nice if we could be doing this from the Hope and Anchor, actually, wouldn't it?
Oh my goodness me! A pint of local ale, some fish and chips, and a good chat into the night by the fire. Wouldn't that be perfect?
That would be absolutely perfect. So I've asked Richard to join this webinar because today is about my book, Crisis Proof, which was published, well, it's actually published on the 31st of December, so just before the end of the year. And so I thought, rather than me just blather away about it, I would ask Richard to ask me some questions about it and kind of the background to it and how I got to where I've got to, but also because Richard himself has very interesting perspective on crisis management himself, having covered, I think, everything from Chilean mine rescue to Costa, Concordia, and many more, Richard.
Yeah, no, I think sadly other people's problems and crises are really what make my job most interesting, because we find ourselves jetting off around the world to report on these issues, which are interesting and fascinating to us, but of course cause many headaches to people like yourself and those attending today's webinar.
Excellent. So for just a minute or two, I'm going to shut up, which is uncharacteristic, and hand over to you then, Richard.
Yeah, well, I was thinking actually about that fact that we've worked together or known each other for at least 25 years. And in that time, I hadn't realised that I'd never actually spoken to you about why you started in crisis management. I mean, it's an excellent book, and it's really clear, and it distills so much of what I've heard from you over that period of time. But I've never actually asked why. Why did you start, and how did you fall into it?
Good question. And actually, from a very young age, from about the age of 5, this was something that I wanted to do. No, it wasn't. Like other little boys, I wanted to be a racing car driver or a fireman or maybe the Aston Villa centre forward, but I didn't have the talent, skill or aptitude for any of those things. And so I didn't end up doing any of those things. And I think probably for many of the people watching this who are themselves involved in crisis management, I bet there will be very few at a relatively early age or even as a teenager that ever thought, I want to end up as a crisis management expert. And I also fit that category. And I guess, in my teenage years and at university, what I figured out was what I was really interested in terms of a career were 3 things. Business, I'm really fascinated and passionate about business. People, really interested in people, and communication. And that kind of got me interested in this area. And then I think the catalyst was there was a 12-month period, 88 and 89, when there were 3 big crises. I was kind of 25, I think, at the time, 24 actually. And within 12 months, we had Exxon Valdez, we had Pan Am Lockerbie, and we had British Midland Kegworth. And Exxon Valdez, I watched that on telly and I thought, that's awful, first of all, the oil spill over Alaska. And it's even worse that the organisation doesn't seem to be doing and saying the right things in response. And then Lockerbie, which was horrendous. I remember watching that on the news in the evening. And clearly there was the enormous human tragedy and everything that's played out since then. But again, as I was watching, I was thinking, well, why isn't the chief executive of Pan Am there? And then a couple of days later, it leaked out that there'd been a warning from the FBI that there might be a terrorist attack. And Pan Am had previously said, no, we haven't had any warning at all. And you think, why are they communicating in a slightly disingenuous way? And then, thankfully, the British Midland example occurred, and I was sat up in my parents' living room in Sutton Coldfield and watching the news, and it was broken into to say there's been an air crash at Kegworth, just outside of East Midlands Airport, and we're speaking with the chief executive, who is on his way to the scene, and it was a guy called Michael Bishop, and it was probably the first time a mobile phone had been used in a news broadcast. We're talking about 1989, and mobile phones were not a thing then. But what really impressed me was how Michael Bishop began communicating literally within minutes of that plane crashing. He was setting the news agenda. He was saying the right things. Within an hour, he was at the scene, being filmed, being interviewed, and handling those interviews really skillfully in terms of his empathy, his compassion, his unwillingness to speculate, and his absolute focus on talking about people. And then he followed that up with visits to the, those who'd been injured in hospital. He clearly prioritized the human side above the immediate impact on his business. And, it was just a brilliant example of crisis leadership. The point being, that really piqued my interest. And I was at that time working in corporate communications, and I thought, yes, I love corporate communications, but what I really want to work in is crisis management. Cut forward, I became head of crisis and issues at a global PR consultancy, worked with some fantastic organizations, including Disney, the International Cricket Council, Procter & Gamble, further kind of built my passion for crisis management, hence setting Insignia up 12 years ago. And ultimately, I think what drives me to do what I do is that I get really angry and upset when I still see organizations 30 years ago damaging themselves, damaging people through their response to a crisis being ineffective. And I want to change that.
That's really interesting to me, because I also get frustrated, often professionally, because I feel that they should be there explaining, not to me, but to the wider public, what's going on. I saw that in the Costa Concordia disaster, stood there by that ship, grounded on the coastline off the coast of Italy. I saw it just a year or so ago in Ethiopia, having flown out to Addis Ababa to see the Boeing crash there, which of all the air crashes I've covered was perhaps the most shocking. And I just felt that really there should have been someone, if I could get from London there that quickly, there should have been someone there from Boeing. Second crash of this aircraft type in a row, the 100 Max, actually, explaining what they were going to be doing and trying to put people's minds at rest. That was a disaster. It seems to me that people don't learn. I mean, you've been doing this for years now. You say you get angry. Why is it that big companies like Boeing and others don't learn?
Yeah, and I think Boeing is absolutely another classic example of the syndrome that we've been talking about. How do such well-established, successful businesses led by very experienced business people continue to get it wrong? So what's the answer? Well, I think the answer is that a crisis is, no, let me start again. The answer is sometimes organizations turn out not to be as good as we thought they were. The crisis exposes real flaws within the organization. I'd like to believe that that is in the minority of cases, the small minority of cases, but just occasionally the crisis, because of its intense spotlight, metaphorically, shines the light on the organization and reveals who and what they really are. I think more often it is because of two things. One, kind of emotional, and one practical. The emotional side is a crisis is an extraordinary event. It is something that a chief executive would hope not to go through on more than one or two occasions in their entire career. But it is a moment when everything is on the line. I mean, lives, jobs, careers, reputation, businesses, value, communities, and you don't have the information that you want. You're under enormous time pressure. You've got loads of questions, and so the amygdala kicks in, the fight, flight, freeze kind of mode, and rational, experienced people do silly things, and they feel fearful, and fear causes people to hide away. So that's the emotional side. The practical side is, and I believe this wholeheartedly, and it's one of the reasons I've written the book, that people find out that they lack the resources, the capabilities, and the tools that they need to respond to this extraordinary situation. Trying to kind of busk it on the most awful day of your business life, when the whole world is looking at you, trying to muddle through without having done that thinking, planning, rehearsal, training beforehand, is not very smart, and we see what happens when that happens.
So I think I saw that in 2011. I flew out to Japan for the earthquake and the tsunami and the Fukushima. Never before would I have had to have factored in a meltdown of a nuclear power plant into my kind of my health and safety and risk assessment of a story. But that was a cultural issue too, right? That there was definitely problems there. People didn't want to acknowledge it, and then subsequently watching that Chernobyl drama doc on Sky, you saw how in these situations actually the culture can be a problem too. It's addressing that early, I suppose, is something that needs to be sorted out.
I think that's such an important point, Richard, and without wanting to relentlessly plug the book throughout, there is a chapter on culture in the book, and the reason it's there is because I completely agree with you. Culture is so important to an organization, or in that case, a nation's ability to respond effectively to a crisis. And it's also important in an organization's ability to prevent a crisis. And so having and putting in place a crisis-resistant culture, I think, is really important. And some of the things to look out for in terms of, do we perhaps have the reverse, a crisis-prone culture? Beware if your organisation is one in which people are unable to challenge people of either high power or kind of who are highly regarded within an organisation. So, a chief executive who will not listen to anybody else in the organisation, and everybody is too frightened to raise an issue, that is a dangerous situation to be in. It can also be like, a star salesperson or a fantastic creative. In the media, it might be a big star whose behaviours are not acceptable, and if they were to become public, could become really damaging to that organisation. Jimmy Savile, for example, if people are allowed to get away with things that bring risk and that there are no sanctions, then that's one indicator of a crisis-prone culture. Another one to think about is how people are incentivised. So, for example, let's imagine this is a chemicals company. If everybody is incentivised to make as many chemicals as possible, as quickly as possible, you may be the most profitable chemical company in the world, but you probably have the one that has the highest chance of having an accident, because no one's being incentivised on safety, they're all being incentivised on productivity. So there's just a couple of examples of how culture affects crisis, a likelihood. And just briefly, you're right, particularly when we're advising organisations managing crises across boundaries, getting those cultural nuances right from a kind of nationality point of view, that's a whole other layer of complexity.
No, I'm really interested in what you're saying about not wishing to question authority. And then you mentioned the chemical company. I just watched that film Dark Waters, which is a great reputational crisis story really for DuPont and that brand Teflon. To see just how damaging ignoring things can be, brushing them under the carpet in the name of profit. I mean, having so many examples of those kind of things out there now, surely people should be saying, hands up, we need to stop all of that, but they don't.
No, and I think, you know, because of the lines of work that you and I operate in, we are spotting and sometimes privy to organisations that are getting it wrong. There are, of course, vast numbers of organisations that are getting it right. And, you know, those with a crisis-resilient culture, they are the ones who are stopping many of the crises happening that would otherwise happen if they had a different culture. And there are also those that are suffering crises, but because they have the right attitude, they are snuffing them out before they come to the attention of the media, for example. So what we are seeing is, by definition, the people who are getting it wrong. Why does that happen? Well, again, it's easy, misguided, but easy to believe it will never happen to us. So, you know, why bother preparing? But what I really like to see in terms of your dark water and the kind of whistleblowing and the listening to people, I love it when we come across a client, and we have many of them, who genuinely and actively encourage, right from the person, you know, in the security gate to those on the factory floor or the call centre, actively encourage them to flag up problems or concerns. They get thanked for flagging them up, and they get dealt with quickly. They don't wait until there's this enormous fire burning when it's too late to address them.
Well, that's reassuring that you're actually coming across businesses like that. And are these people that are scenario planning, they're tabletop exercising, they're running their worst nightmares through so they can work out how to handle it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a very, very big advocate of scenario planning and also of exercising. I think they are of enormous value in preparing you for a crisis. On the scenario planning side, I mean, there's a story I read, which I think is a very powerful one, and it dates back to an air crash in 1977. In fact, the worst air crash ever in terms of fatalities, when over 500 people died at Tenerife, when a KLM plane collided with a Pan Am plane. One was landing, one was about to take off, and one virtually landed on top of the other. And two of the 61 survivors were a married couple called Paul and Floy Heck. Paul Heck, as a child, had been in a theatre where there was a fire and had, you know, luckily escaped. But from that moment on, whenever he was in an enclosed space, would always look for the exit, plan his escape route, and know exactly what he would do if anything went wrong. And he was the guy on any plane, including the Pan Am plane at Tenerife, who would actually listen, despite the fact he'd heard it 50 times before, to the flight attendant's announcement. He would look at the card in front of him, and he would then mentally rehearse, okay, so there's the nearest exit. I would walk down here, I would turn right, it's 8 rows, oh, it's that wing, and that's how I would get out. So when this horrific crash happened, his wife went into an almost trance. He said, get up, into the aisle, down the aisle, 8 rows, to the right, open the door, onto the wing, you know, pretty much the first people out of that plane. They survived. And the reason they survived, and there were many others that could have survived, was simply because the others had not scenario planned. So that's a very powerful personal example for a corporation or an organization thinking through your worst nightmares. Let's say it's a cyber attack, and actually sitting down and walking through, how would we respond to this? In principle, what decisions would we make? What actions would we need to take, and what resources would we need? Actually walking that through is so helpful when it happens for real.
Now, I spend my life doing that in hostile environments, trying to work out what possibly could go wrong that's a threat to our life, you know, a threat to the story and how we're going to get somewhere, how we're going to get out of somewhere, because we normally find ourselves trying to get into places other people are trying to leave.
Yes.
So, and I think if you have an understanding of what might go wrong, it stops that fight or flight reaction, doesn't it? Somewhat.
Exactly that. And I mean, on your exercising point, another inspiration for me, really, and a story I tell, and it always makes me feel genuinely emotional. And so I may get emotional when I tell it, but this for me is the most powerful example of the value of exercising. And it's a guy called Rescaler. He was the head of security at Morgan Stanley in the South Tower of the Twin Towers. He was there when they had the truck bomb in the basement of the South Tower, and he'd actually predicted that could happen and felt that security was a bit lax. It did happen. He then became convinced that if there was to be another attack, it would come from the air. And so as a consequence, Morgan Stanley occupied 22 of the highest towers 22 highest floors on the South Tower. And what Rick Rescaler used to make the 2,700 people do on a quarterly basis was walk down. I think it was tens and tens of flights of stairs to get out of those offices and to the muster point. Every quarter, everybody up, leave it, down the stairs, out. And you can imagine, I actually met someone who was part of their workforce, and they said, God, it was a real pain in the backside. And everyone used to moan about it. And, oh, can I just, no, you can't just finish the email, up and out. When 9/11 happened, of the 2,700 people that worked in those offices at Morgan Stanley, only 13 people died, which was way less than another organizer of the 13 who died because he was heading. See, I'm feeling emotional again. He was heading back up the stairs to try and get them. Now that is leadership in a crisis. Again, powerful example of how rehearsal builds muscle memory and means that people do the right things when a real crisis occurs.
That's a great example of really strong leadership. In terms of the qualities and the characteristics of leaders, I know in the book you talk about that. What are some of the key characteristics that someone might need if they're going to lead their organization through a crisis?
Yeah, there are a whole load of characteristics, and let me give you two or three. I think one of the critical ones is the courage to make timely decisions. I think we've witnessed examples of leaders who leave decision-making too late. It's very easy to make a perfect decision after the event or a little bit too late. In a crisis, your goal as a leader is to influence events, not react to them. And what that requires is you having the courage and the conviction and the passion to make a decision without all of the information, but based on your analysis of the situation and what you believe the right thing to do is. And I'll give you a little COVID example of that. If we think back, and this is, particularly for those in the UK, if we think back to last March when, things were closing in, you may recall that one of the announcements from the government was that the public shouldn't go to restaurants, but there was no requirement for restaurants to shut down. So many restaurants, understandably, remained open, A, because they hadn't been told to shut down, and B, because they were hoping to, earn a bit of revenue. Yeah. The founders of Hawksmoor, Hugh and Will, they made the decision themselves to shut the restaurants. They said, they went out and publicly said it, we haven't been told to shut down, but we clearly believe it is the right thing to do for our employees, for our customers. So with a heavy heart, we will shut our restaurants down. And it's a bigger case study. They have been brilliant in their handling of the pandemic in terms of communication and putting their stakeholders first. But it's a very good example of an early decision, which was a hard one, but which was the right one to take.
So they will see a benefit from that because people see them as responsible. And now, well, GMT visit started off as quite a toll. The news wire now, really. Can you see a crisis coming? Can you gauge a way of dealing with a problem that is brewing, a storm cloud that's kind of sweeping in?
Yeah. So, a couple of thoughts on that one, Richard. I mean, again, began when social media wasn't a thing. I mean, it really wasn't. And people used to talk about the criticality of getting the first 24 hours right and making sure that you had a statement out by the end of the first day. Clearly, social media has changed all of that. And again, frankly, it is one of the biggest reasons why planning and preparing in advance of the crisis is even more important now than it ever was, because the time available is so short. So social media has had a dramatic effect on how quickly people become aware of crises, how quickly they spread, and how far they spread. So it's presented a huge challenge for organisations. You're right, though, it can also play a role in the resolution of a crisis in two ways, really. One is using social media to your advantage. If I think back to Merlin and the Smiler accident, the social media team at Alton Towers was magnificent on the day that accident happened. They not only provided, regular, immediate, frequent information about what was going on in all kinds of different ways and channels, they also engaged with people who were either asking questions or expressing concern. Again, they got a lot of support and understanding at a very difficult time because they were engaging, they were sharing information. And the third thing, kind of the point you began with, it is a good source of intelligence so long as you use it with discretion. In other words, if you become obsessed with looking at everything that's being said about you on social media, that will be one of the causes of not making a decision. If you can have someone giving you a sense of what's going on and a sense of what the sentiment is and the key issues which are coming to the fore, it can be really helpful in keeping you well informed in a crisis.
Now, listen, I realise it's half an hour has gone by now. We could we could keep chatting all day. I just say, listen, this is a good book. I'm not just saying that because you're a pal of mine, but it really does work very well. You can dip into it, and I live with someone who also deals with crises, and she's impressed too. So that's all good news. We are living in the middle of a national crisis. Final question for you at the moment: a worldwide crisis, and there will be pressure on a lot of people listening right now, knowing that. Well, they don't know exactly what's going to happen, but they know that potentially they're going to face some pressure, some issue over the coming weeks or months. I hope that isn't the case, but what one piece of advice can you tell them right now to prepare, apart from buying this, of course?
Of course. And Richard, if you're okay, we are okay to continue for another 15, 20 minutes.
Okay. I know people are at home. I just realised that people slot their lunches and various other things in, so I didn't want to just keep talking and talking.
No, that's fine. I mean, let me just check, because there are a couple of questions. If one of them is, how long is this going on for, then no, it isn't. So, I mean, if you're okay to keep going till 2, Richard, I am. If you're not, then please.
No, I am absolutely. I'm absolutely fine. I just didn't want to. I know people's time is precious, even though they may, like me, be working out of the kitchen or wherever they are.
No, that's fine. And yeah, okay. So, but in answer to your question, what should people be thinking about doing tomorrow? I guess it comes back to the scenario planning and the exercising thing that we touched on earlier. One of the things that is different now clearly is that what you just said, most of us are working from home. And when the next crisis strikes, and I mean what I might call loosely a conventional crisis, so if you're a food company, a product recall, if you're a financial services company, a cyber attack, you will need to manage that crisis with your team dispersed and operating from home. I would suggest if as a minimum you haven't scenario planned how you would do that, and even better, haven't run a desktop or a full exercise to rehearse how you would do that, you will find that more difficult than would otherwise be the case. So I'd really be encouraging people to plan for that, so that when the next crisis happens, you've already rehearsed doing it.
Because a lot of people will have a file of prepared scenarios, statements, and other things. It's knowing who's got it, I suppose, in those circumstances.
Yes, it is, and kind of, I guess that, a quick swig of water before I continue. Yeah, when you talk about a big file, I guess that brings me on to another hobby horse, which I also cover in the book, which is, the value and purpose of a crisis management plan. I well remember in my early career being hugely impressed with a client who had, a lever arch file this thick of about 300 pages, which they proudly showed me as their plan to be deployed in a crisis. And I'm not even exaggerating. And at the time, I was hugely impressed. But it became clear to me, not too long after that, that is not a plan that can be used in a crisis. So, my view on a good crisis management plan is it shouldn't be a step-by-step guide for every scenario, because what that almost means, if it's like an Airfix kit or set of instructions from IKEA, if that particular crisis doesn't occur, then you're not well geared up to respond to it. And Gus Whitcomb, one of the contributors to the book, who's head of crisis management at Cathay Pacific and was head of American Airlines on 9/11, he talks about the American Airlines crisis management plan, and he said there were three things in that plan which were kind of the fundamentals of that plan. One was that if there was a plane crash, we will fly to the site of the accident, immediately. The second was that all of the kind of steps in the crisis management plan talked about a single aircraft crashing. And thirdly, it talked about controlling the communication agenda, being proactive with communication. When 9/11 happened, they couldn't take off, all planes were grounded. It was 2 planes, not 1, and they were banned by the White House from communicating. And he said, we had to scramble. It was that taught him to develop crisis management plans which are sufficiently flexible to deal with all situations, not ones which are tied to a specific set of circumstances. And I'm a big advocate for that.
Something I read in the book, and I hadn't come across this before, because maybe it's not the world I inhabit on your side of things. Crisis documentation. Tell me about that, because there are people in that book that say that this is really important, but I think I need to understand more what crisis documentation is. Yeah,
so it links very much to the crisis management plan that I was just talking about. But a good crisis management plan is it'll probably be a physical document. It will also be stored electronically, so you can access it wherever you are. But for me, a good crisis management plan gives you a structured, purposeful way of working in a crisis. Its aim is to set you off in the right direction, to make sure that you do the most important things first, to make sure that you don't forget anything, and to make sure that you have all the information and resources in one place that you would most likely need in a crisis. And it does have things like template statements in it, which will save you 15 or 20 minutes when you need it most. But it must be clear, simple, well-structured, flow charts, and tick-off checklists. And frankly, it must also be rehearsed. Otherwise, it won't be picked up when the pressure's really on.
So I mean, so that is what gets you through the first hour,
Yeah.
you know, to get over that first hurdle.
Correct. And my view is, if you're still it would be quite unusual to be still using your crisis management plan in the same way, certainly by, let's say, day 4 of a crisis. My view is that if your crisis management plan, as I say, sets you off in the right direction and it sees you through day 1, then it has served its purpose. Anything more is a real bonus. But a crisis isn't, by definition, a crisis is not business as usual. And organisations which try to operate in a business as usual way will fail to manage the crisis. One very kind of specific example is meetings. Really kind of simple example. I don't know if you've ever had this, Richard, but I think we've all been in meetings which have either gone on forever and appear directionless and never come up with any conclusions, or we've been in meetings where there are sub-meetings going on. We've been in meetings where people are actually on their phones. In a crisis, your meetings must be focused, crisp, structured. Everybody's view must be taken, but no one must dominate. We must end up with a series of decisions and actions, and they must be crystal clear, not vague or kind of inferred. And that is one of the jobs that a good crisis management plan can help you do, as can rehearsal.
But I guess that means that not just one person needs to know what's in that plan, then everyone needs to know it, because it is going to be, I'll say sod's law, that the person that's written the crisis plan, that knows it inside out, is the one that's either caught up in the crisis and can't respond, or is somewhere else. You all need to know what's going. You need to be singing from the same hymn sheet, I guess is what I'm saying.
Absolutely. And, again, one of the things that the pandemic has brought home is that, you're not always going to have your A team available to manage your crisis. So you need to have both your, absolute ideal team members briefed and trained on the plan, but you also need to have deputies, because it does seem to be a truism that, on the day that the crisis happens, the very person you would most want to be around isn't around. And so you're absolutely right. It does need to be embedded within as many people as possible, so that you've got strength in depth, and whoever is part of that team, is available to do that. And, with our clients, for example, one of our big mining clients, we will rehearse the A team, but we'll also rehearse, sorry, I shouldn't use this phrase, but the B team as well, because it may very well be, members of that B team that are required. And by the way, given I've used that pejorative term, it may turn out there are some absolute stars in the B team that we think should be in the A team. You don't know that until you've rehearsed them.
Well, so often I come across situations where people are under real pressure. They wheel out the big guns, but the big guns don't always perform, do they? And it is sometimes those people who are a bit closer to the action who can give a much better response, and perhaps a more human response.
Correct. And I can think of a particular client where one of their mottos, and they live it as well as saying it, is, in a crisis, leave your ego at the door. And what they mean is, unless there is an absolutely compelling reason why a person needs to be in the room, a job title doesn't get you into that room. What gets you into that room are the right capabilities, characteristics, skills, personality traits to make a difference, because we haven't got time for egos or job titles. We've actually got everything on the line, and we need the best people in the room. And I think one of the other things that you allude to is, again, coming back to the crisis leader, the best crisis leaders will get the best out of their team. What that means is not just dominate the conversation and making all decisions based on their own entire team, and not just those in the team that are themselves confident about spotting there's someone there in the corner who hasn't said very much. It's the financial controller. They're a real analytical, a bit of an introvert. I need to bring them in. You know, John, what's your view on this? And John, as an analytical person, has spotted something that these, you know, charismatic leaders, salespeople, marketeers, communicators haven't. But the skill of the leader is to get that insight out of those that are not necessarily naturally contributing.
Can you get to the point with a crisis where you just have to put your hands in the air and say, this is going really badly, we need to start again? Or, I mean, just thinking of some circumstances of places that I've been with, you know, reports that I've done where I've thought, but this is not going very well for them.
Yeah, I mean, clearly you would hope not to end up in that place. And I would hope that if you have taken the right steps, you wouldn't. However, what is definitively worse is starting off in the wrong way and making mistakes, and then digging your hole deeper, continuing with them and repeating the same mistakes. Crisis leadership requires humility. And, you know, some leaders are not very good with humility. Crisis leadership sometimes requires you to change your mind. Some people, having said that, you know, red is red and blue is blue, are not willing to change their minds on that. The really effective crisis leader will be prepared to change course. And I think it's another thing that needs to become a discipline. It's not just intuitively. One of the other golden rules, you asked me about golden rules earlier on of crisis response, is re-evaluating regularly, because there's a real danger of tunnel vision. I mean, it's what you're describing. You're in this situation, you're under pressure, you know, there's a real tendency just to keep going. Every now and then, you need to take a step back and say, okay, what is the situation now? What's changed? Where are we? What do we need to do now? And again, it's something that inexperienced crisis teams fail to do, and it's something that is learned through experience.
No, I was just thinking back to British Airways and the launch of Terminal 5, and I was standing in the building on the morning of the launch with Willie Walsh, and Willie was saying how wonderful this whole thing was. It was their new home. It was all going brilliantly. And there'd already been some mutterings that things weren't going so well down below, you know, with baggage handling and staff getting in through security barriers. And as the day went on, it was really clear that things hadn't been going very well at all. But they took a long time to step back from the positive PR push to the crisis management situation. And sometimes it is like that, isn't it? That you find that you think you're setting out saying something's amazing, then you find yourself having to do a complete 180 degree turn.
Yeah, and I think if I was to, you know, really simplify crisis management, so I don't know why I wrote a 300-page book, but if I was to really simplify it, it's very similar to, you know, great customer service in a restaurant. You know, you go to this fabulous restaurant and you have expectations of what they will deliver, and it turns out to be really rather poor. You know, do you want the waiter or the manager telling you, no, actually it's not poor, it's fantastic, it's fine? Or do you want the waiter or manager to say, you're absolutely right, you know, we've fallen below the high standards that we set for ourselves, this shouldn't have happened, please, I apologize, you know, come back and have the full tasting menu on us, this will not happen again. And, you know, the same approach in a crisis, the ability to say, do you know what, you're right, we've screwed up, but we're going to put it right, we care, and we're going to put it right, is at the heart of successful crisis management. And if you keep fighting, and not empathizing, you won't succeed. And it's all about, as well, you know, it's not about you, the business, it's about the people who are affected by what you have done or become involved in.
And showing empathy. I mean, we've talked a lot about empathy, and certainly I've been covering the American election for what seems like months and months now. But you know, the real change in Washington was Joe Biden suddenly becoming an empathetic character, relating to people. You have to do that. You have to relate to the people who are affected. You have to show empathy.
You do, and it is for chief executives who spend traditionally most of their time, talking to the city and going for targets and picking up the business and inspiring about the great things that are going on. I think switching into a more humble, empathetic, compassionate tone of voice can be challenging, and I understand that. Again, it's why A, having the right people, and B, rehearsing them is so important. But I think particularly because of the styles of leadership that we've seen over the last kind of decade, and in very recent times as well, I think there has been a bit of a kickback against the kind of egotistical, stereotypical male dominant style of leadership, and I think people are looking for and responding much better to the more compassionate human approach. If we look at political leaders, if we look at New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, I think she is a phenomenal leader. I know very little about her politics. I know what party she comes from, but I know very little about her politics or policies. But when I saw her communicating about the Christchurch mosque, shootings, oh my God, I believed her, and I was inspired by her, and I liked her, and I wanted to follow her, and I wanted to cry with her, because she just came across and was so warm and genuine. And that, for me, is the style of leadership that anyone should really aspire to.
Yeah, so for a politician, that might make you want to vote for them, which is essentially their sell. But for a business and organisation, it might make you, as a member of the public, want to get involved, might want to buy from them, might want to, be a customer in the future.
Absolutely. If I go right back to Michael Bishop, my initial inspiration, you warmed to him. Now, the irony in that British Midland story was that actually it was a British Midland employee, the captain, that caused the crash to happen. Clearly not purposefully, but they had a faulty engine, and on approach to the airport, he turned off the good engine rather than faulty engine. Therefore, the plane crashed. Despite that, because of the way that Michael Bishop communicated, sales went up and their reputation, if anything, was embellished as a result of him not doing that in a Machiavellian way, but just doing and saying the right things. People respected, trusted, and had confidence in him and his organisation.
Yeah, well, listen, I'm going to pass that on to Tim Sutton, who's a good friend of mine, who was running that PR response. So and I think it's a textbook, as you say, a textbook response, which got a good, which got a better outcome considering the disaster that had happened. I was thinking about. Go on, sorry.
That's right. I was going to turn the tables on you, really, because clearly we are now into the last 10 minutes. Who has really impressed you with the way that they have either led or communicated in crisis from a media perspective?
Certainly not the current government as we speak during our national crisis, because we seem to go from one disaster to the other. And maybe I'm a cynic and I can see where they're trying to push the good news to perhaps deflect attention away from the bad. I think the one that I've been involved with where I was really impressed was the Chilean Miners, where we found ourselves sat around a hole in the middle of the Atacama Desert, miles from anywhere, and with the families of the men who were buried underground, the mining engineers who were trying to dig the hole or the tunnel to get them out. But the Chilean government actually took control of that amazingly well. I mean, it didn't look good, really, because there'd obviously been a real problem in terms of the way the mine was being run, the conditions that had been allowed to develop. And yet they turned what was a really huge PR disaster into something quite amazing, and it became a worldwide event. And to be there, to see that happen was quite incredible. And it was managed, it really was managed, but it was managed really well. Compare and contrast that to the Thai cave boys. There was a couple of years ago out in northern Thailand, those young footballers who got stuck in the cave. Again, a lack of supervision of that area of problems in the system perhaps led to that being able to happen in the first place. But that was not handled as well. They started off well, but culturally it didn't work as well as as telling that story. And I thought that they could have learned so much more from the Chilean situation, because that really was handled quite well.
It comes back to what you were talking about and what we were both talking about earlier on. It's this counterintuitive thing about, actually, I think particularly the media in this instance, if you actually open up and bring people in and share information and access with them, that is incredibly scary, because you don't know what the result of that's going to be. But actually, it is almost always the most effective way of getting the best outcome ultimately, compared with, putting the barriers up and pushing people away. People will fight even harder and go, as you well know, here, there and everywhere to get the story from other people who may not have the full facts or certainly won't have your best interests at heart.
No, that certainly happened in Thailand, because initially they welcomed the attention because it was bringing in the expertise and the funding for the rescue. But then, of course, the moment they knew that they could start getting them out, they pushed everyone away, and that caused more trouble, I think, than probably they would have expected. Again, a cultural issue. Working in different countries, people have different ways. The Latin America is much more emotional and willing to share their feelings, and saddened by what's going on. Two near tragedies that were handled very differently.
Interesting. I am going to hijack the last few minutes just to, just to let those people who have not maybe seen the book, just let them know a little bit about kind of who it's for, and what makes it different from other books, and then use the little special offer for tomorrow and Friday. So I guess I think the reason I wrote this book was because, as I say, I wanted to make a difference, but also because I did think there was a bit of a gap in the market. There are loads of really good crisis management books out there, and I have read most of them, and I say there's some great ones. I felt there were very few which focused specifically on how to prepare for a crisis. And I do believe that what you do before the crisis will, to a very large extent, determine how effectively you respond when the crisis happens. So this book, which I've dropped on the floor, is, primarily focused on what you do beforehand. The second thing I think that makes it slightly different is that it is not aimed at people like me, people who spend their entire lives working in crisis management, do nothing other than crisis management. It's primarily aimed at people who have been given responsibility for crisis management within their organisation, but it is one of a number of different, responsibilities that they have. So it might be the head of communications, head of health and safety, head of business continuity, head of risk, head of HR, head of legal. Our clients come from many different backgrounds, and very few spend all of their time working on crisis management, and quite a number, don't have training or a background in crisis management. And this book is designed to give them the skills, confidence, understanding and capability to be able to be your organisation's crisis management champion really effectively without becoming, a crisis management consultant. I'm sure crisis management consultants will find this useful, but it's more for those individuals within organisations who've had that responsibility thrust upon them. And I think the third thing that hopefully makes it a little bit different is that it is deliberately written, I hope, in a clear, accessible and practical way. It is not an academic textbook. It is something that I hope people can read, you know, maybe in one sitting, certainly over the course of a week, you can get through it. And I hope that I have expressed the important kind of messages and things to do in a very clear and simple way. And so in terms of tomorrow and Friday's special offer, thanks to everybody who has already read or bought a copy. But for those of you who are digital readers, just for tomorrow and Friday, the 4th and 5th of February, the book will be available as a Kindle or digital version for 99 pence if you're in the UK, or 99 cents, which is even cheaper if you are in the States. So if you go to Amazon at any point tomorrow or Friday, you can get the digital copy of the book for 99 pence or cents. And we'll send a link out with those details tomorrow so you can just easily click on it. But that's my advert over, Richard. I don't know if you've got any final questions.
No, I think really well done, because I mean, it is genuinely clear and easy, and you know, you can dip in to exactly the right bit that you want to look at, and it's well laid out. And I'm jolly impressed, especially since this. I mean, I know this is decades of experience, but it's been distilled very well, but quite quickly, right? You've worked on this throughout this last year of pandemic and problems.
Yeah, I think the pandemic really was a kind of catalyst for me. I, you know, dabbled with the idea of writing a book for a long time. I've never wanted to write a book just to write a book. It's not actually something that I need to do for myself. But I just got to the point at which I thought, you know, this frustration with people sometimes not being able to do the right things in response to a crisis, I need to try and do something to help that. And the pandemic itself, we spent a lot of time in the early stages of the pandemic working without being paid for SMEs to help them make sense of what was going on and to try to help them to stay in business and to manage the initial stages of the crisis. And it just reinforced for me again how important it is to get that knowledge out there. And it also made me think, come on, this is looking like it's not going to be the greatest of years in a number of different ways. Why not get that book out there by the end of this year? So I spent quite a few weeks in Hope Cove writing this book. And yeah, I'm pleased I did. And I do hope that you know, people who read it find a genuine value and that it does make a difference in enabling people to respond effectively should the worst occur.
Well, listen, I don't think there's any excuse now if I turn up with a camera crew on someone's doorstep for them to have a poor response, because they've got the tools. It's there. Well done. Good luck with it, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you to everybody who's joined us. Thank you very much.